Cable management. Love it, hate it. It's a fact of life for any PC building enthusiast, myself included. And I could talk for 5 or 10 minutes about how to get the best look by tucking, tying, twisting, and training your cables in the right ways. But I'm the type of guy who would prefer to preclude or prevent cable clutter rather than dealing with it in the most elegant way that I can. And what better way to avoid cable management in the first place than to reduce the number of cables you have at all. So that's exactly what I'll be talking about, how to build a computer using the fewest cables possible. So let's start with the CPU cooler. For every fan that's on the cooler, there's a cable bringing power to it. With larger coolers, there's often more fans, so I recommend limiting it to a cooler with one fan, or maybe a larger cooler that could use more fans, but only using one in that case. Fanless heat sinks are also an option, but they're really only viable if you have a low power CPU or a lot of room in your case, because without a fan they have to be much bigger to dissipate the same amount of heat. Also, for higher TDP fanless coolers, they tend to be much more expensive than their fanned brethren, so keep that in mind as well if you decide to go that route. I'm just going to throw this in here. Don't put fans on your RAM. There's no need, and if your system's getting enough airflow for the CPU cooler and your graphics card coolers to keep those two parts cool enough, your RAM's going to be fine unless you're doing some crazy overclocking, and in that case you really don't need to take my advice in this video for the most part anyways. If you've got a hard drive or a 2.5-inch SATA SSD, then you've got a power and a data cable running from it. If you don't have an SSD, then you're kind of living in the Stone Age, so you should remedy that with all deliberate speed. M.2 SSDs that are not NVMe, meaning they're SATA drives, are comparably priced to their 2.5-inch counterparts, and they require no cables at all versus the two that you'd normally have for power and data for a 2.5-inch drive. So if your motherboard has an M.2 slot or an extra PCIe slot, if you're using a graphics card and one's already being used up, then you can upgrade or switch over to M.2 for your storage drive and not have to worry about SATA power or data cables ever again. If you do need large drives, there's not so much you can do about that. It just comes down to, at that point, really just cable management. And that's what this is about. We're reducing cables, but there will be some cable management required, even though we're using much fewer cables in the first place. All mid to high-end graphics cards require auxiliary power straight from the power supply in addition to what the PCIe slot already provides. However, graphics cards like the 1050 Ti and the RX 560 don't need that extra power or the extra cable. So if you aren't using all the horsepower in your current graphics card and the cables bother you enough, then switching to a lower tier card might be an option. Power supplies are the source of all your cables. As such, it's ideal to limit the number of cables on your power supply to only those that you'll be using. Non-modular power supplies have every cable you could possibly need for your PC. But if you're trying to limit the number of cables, then you should opt for a semi or even fully modular power supply. Fully modular power supplies allow you to connect only the cables that you'll use, and this frees up, or potentially frees up, space inside your case where you might otherwise just stuff all the unused cables if you were to use a non-modular power supply. One thing that I've noticed about my own habits is how infrequently I use the front panel USB and headphone jacks. Now you should already know that the front panel connects to the motherboard with cables. So if we're going to do this right, we can completely disregard the front panel audio and the USB connector. If you're wanting to go really hardcore, you could remove the power button as well and then just leave your system with the side panel off and a screwdriver next to it so you can power it on and power it off just by shorting out the circuits every time you want to do that. Or just find a motherboard with a built-in power and reset switch, which is relatively common on more high-end motherboards. But it's still kind of a dumb idea. RGB is all the rage, so I won't say don't include it because I don't want to be dragged into the street by a mob, but I will say that RGB lighting that is not native to the motherboard, the graphics card, or the case may introduce more cables and connectors that you might not want to deal with. I might actually be doing a build following sort of this guide later in a week or two, maybe a month. Sometime in the relatively near future, I will be doing a build based on this. So that about wraps it up. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.